I'm sure that we're all aware that plastics is a very hot topic at the moment. And I know, Michael, you entitled it single-use items rather than just specifically plastic, but I'm sure that there will be a few bits on plastic too. I'm sure you're all aware there's a new plastics draft bill, which was presented not too long ago to Parliament by the Friends of the Earth and the National Federation of Women's Institutes. This has a cross-party support, so it'll be interesting for us to see how this goes on and what happens with this nationally, to see how this will help us to cut some plastic use. I'm going to now hand over to Michael Lenigan. He's the Environmental Policy Advisor. Once Michael has finished, as I said, we will open out to questions and continue with our discussions. So if you could all, again, just change your name so we know where your questions are coming from. I'm going to hand you over to Michael.
Okay, hi everyone, and it's a pleasure to be back presenting again to the EAUC members. Let me just see if I can get my screen shared. So is that showing up?
Yeah. Let me just check. There's a few people who are saying they can't hear you, or they can't hear me. Can everyone hear us now? Yeah, a few people saying they can.
Nodding there, yeah.
Okay.
And is my screen showing up?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Right. So shall I carry on, or? Oh, no, you've muted. Okay, all right, well, I'm gonna.
Yeah, we can carry on.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I'll be presenting an evidence review and I guess a bit of a recap of some of the things we talked about, or I talked about last time I presented on this topic. I am gonna go through the lens, of single-use cups, because that's where we've been doing quite a bit of research in the past 18 months since I last spoke. However, as I'll explain, I think a lot of what I'll be covering is very relevant to single-use items in general, plastics, and so on. And I'll try and make those connections throughout. So let's see if this is okay. So briefly, my name is Michael Lenihan. I work for Zero Waste Scotland as the Environmental Policy Advisor, and in essence, we exist to really bring about the circular economy and create a society where resources are valued and nothing is wasted. And we work on behalf of the Scottish Government, and we also receive funding from the European Union. So why focus on single-use drinks cups? Well, the issues that are affecting this particular single-use item are very common across the board. So issues of data, how many cups are we talking about? There's a lot of work has gone into trying to figure out how many disposable coffee cups or single-use cups are used each year in Scotland. And when straws became a real focus, there was a lot of work trying to figure out how many straws we're talking about, and if it's plastic cutlery or so on. There are so many single-use items out there, and the data gaps are quite enormous because it's only really coming to the fore as an issue that we want to start to understand and manage and map. So that is a commonality across the piece. The tension, or the sort of the argument between recycling versus prevention is another similarity, where some parties really want to focus on recycling, and then others are, such as Zero Waste Scotland, are trying to focus efforts more on prevention of single-use consumption in favor of alternatives. And that is common across single-use items and plastics. The role of biodegradables, what role should they play? Do they have a role? Is this a temporary trend or something that's here to stay? And if it is here to stay, how do we adapt to this? The waste management sector, consumer behaviors, purchasing habits, how retailers consume and then handle these materials, that is common across. And then there's this sort of conflicting agendas and messaging. So there are always incumbent interests that are based around the current material types, the current products, the current service models, and particularly when it comes to prevention, this can seem like a threat to the sort of status quo. And so there's often different camps trying to promote different messaging and different ways of framing these issues. And then finally, and the area that I'm most interested in, I think hopefully you're interested in, is how do we drive behavior change? How do we change systems to design out single-use items, to design out problematic materials and replace them with better alternatives? So as I say, I'm going to be focusing on single-use drinks cups, but I will link it back, and I'm happy to take questions on plastics as well, and other single-use items. And we are doing work on these as well, but I think we've got some of the best insight comes from our studies on single-use cups. So I'm going to do a bit of a recap throughout to talk about some of the things, to cover some of the things I spoke of last time. But I'm just they're going to be sprinkled in there along with, some of the new evidence that I'll be sharing. So first, talking about sort of the issue in general for cups. Here is an area where we do have a number. It's a number that's widely used. It's used by government. It's been used by the Environmental Audit Committee in Westminster, and also by the Scottish government. So in the UK, the estimate is that there's 2.5 billion single-use coffee cups consumed each year. However, there are estimates that are much higher than this, double that, for example. And this just shows the kind of uncertainty around even this single product. But for the moment, we're using this 2.5 billion figure, and it works out to be about 200 million in Scotland, for those who are interested. When it comes to recycling, the figures that are used currently is that only 1 in 400 disposable coffee cups are recycled. However, a recent industry report from the Paper Cup Recycling and Recovery Group, which is an industry body that represents a range of retailers, claims that that rate has increased over the last 2 years to 1 in 25. However, we haven't adopted this figure because we haven't seen the method by which this was calculated, so we just don't know enough about that number to use it yet. Recycling remains the primary industry focus when it comes to single-use items, whether it's cups or others. And the reason is because it improves but preserves the existing system. So it's about making single-use items less environmentally intensive, but it's not about eliminating them. It's not about reducing them. It's about continuing to do exactly what we're doing, but with better environmental outcomes. So it also frames the issue, and you can see this often in the way industry groups talk about disposable coffee cups, for example. It frames the issue in part as a consumer problem. It's that consumers aren't recycling enough, and we need to somehow get them to recycle more. It's not a problem with the service provision or the business model or the product line. It's really that consumers really just need to be encouraged to change their behavior and adopt greater recycling. It also implies that it's a waste infrastructure problem, and you do see this come up a lot too, that we need more street-side recycling bins. We need more plants that are capable of handling single-use paper cups. We need more collection services. And there's a case to be made for some of these things. However, as we'll get into, that alone, simply providing more collection infrastructure is not sufficient to result in a higher recycling rate or sufficiently comprehensive recycling system. And I've just highlighted here in the case of disposable coffee cups, hot drinks cups. In fact, the problem that makes them so difficult to recycle it is plastic, but it is the tiniest little bit of plastic. So it's about 1% of the total mass of the cup, and it's that very thin waterproof plastic lining on the inside of the cup, which is adhered to the paper. And because it's adhered to the paper, it's very difficult to separate it out, and therefore recycle the fiber from the paper and recycle the plastic. So it is a plastic problem, even though the majority of the material in a cup is paper. And also, I just highlighted this article, which was based on an industry group papers. So this would be I think it's the paper cup group. I have to check that, but anyway, and they've released a report saying that a latte levy, which was being discussed at the UK level, would cost the UK £819 million and also risk 11,000 jobs in manufacturing and retail sector. And it's a really interesting line of argument, because what this is actually saying is that waste is good for the economy. And of course that is true. The more material consumption that we undertake, the more money is generated. A similar argument could be made. We should all go out and buy 2 meals and throw one in the bin and eat the other. That would be good for the economy. And it's the same with this argument here, that consuming single-use items over and over and over again and then throwing them out, that generates economic value and it generates jobs. And so if we frame it in the right way, as is done here, then what we're really saying is we need to protect those jobs and we need to not rock the boat. But the underlying argument is waste is good for the economy and we need to continue with the wasteful system. So that was the issue with recycling. Then we should touch on biodegradable packaging or biodegradable single-use items. And I've got biodegradable in quotes because it's a misleading term. And while there are many different types of quote-unquote biodegradable materials, generally what they are is actually compostable. And that is a really important difference, because it means that they really need to be sent to an appropriate composting facility to be managed. A lot of food waste, for example, goes to anaerobic digestion, and that is not a suitable way to treat compostable materials. And there's a real lack of data on biodegradable packaging, and it's some work that we'll be doing later this year. But it's a really common solution. It's buying a single-use solution to a single-use problem. And it's easy to see why so many organizations, so many retailers, so many businesses and consumers turn to biodegradable, quote-unquote biodegradable packaging, because it slots into the existing service model. It really doesn't require any change. You just stop buying one item and replace it with another item and carry on as usual. And so it's typically the first option that consumers and retailers and businesses and so on turn to when they decide they want to do something about single-use plastics or problematic materials. But the problem with biodegradables is everything in the waste journey needs to go right for that material to wind up in a compost facility. And if anything goes wrong along the way, it will be diverted to landfill or incineration. And that is very often what happens. So first, the consumer needs to recognize that this is a biodegradable container. Then they need to be able to find a place to put it, and they have to care enough to go and find that place to put it. Then it needs to be collected by a waste contractor who actually operates a compost facility. And then when it arrives at the compost facility, it needs to make its way across a picking line and be recognized as a compostable item and allowed to stay in that line. And of course, operators will take a least risk approach. So as things are flying past on the picking line, if there's any doubt about whether or not it's compostable or not, and a lot of these items look very much like any other item, it will be picked out, assumed to be plastic or whatever, not compostable, and it will be picked out and put into the residual waste bin. So very often I hear from organizations that say, well, don't worry, we've switched to biodegradables. And the first thing I ask them is, well, have you talked to your waste contractor? Have you confirmed that they can handle this material? Have you put out your have you put out appropriate bins and signage and so on to ensure that you're collecting these items appropriately? And very often that critical work has not been done, and so we don't at this point recommend biodegradables. but we certainly recommend that if you are going to go with biodegradables, it is not simply enough to purchase them in place of what you're already buying and make no further changes. You really need to look at your waste system, your signage, your consumer engagement, and talk to your waste contractor to guarantee that this material can be properly treated. So what I'm here to really talk about is the case for prevention, and why prevention is the first thing that we should all be focusing on when it comes to single-use items. And whereas recycling can improve the last stage in the story of a product, so the waste impacts of that product, and biodegradable could improve those impacts as well, and possibly the manufacturing impacts, depending on what you're replacing. Only prevention eliminates all of the impacts of a product. And so when you eliminate that product entirely, none of the impacts occur. And that's basically the life cycle approach to products and materials, which is we want to avoid the entire life cycle. We want to eliminate it. So that is why, on the waste hierarchy, prevention is at the top, and why that's the work that we primarily focus on at Zero Waste Scotland. So I'd like to introduce what I'm calling the single-use hierarchy, and I mentioned the waste hierarchy, so this is on a very similar line, and it's kind of offered here as a guide to how you should try and approach problematic items that you're looking to tackle, single-use items. So the very first thing you should do is try to remove those items altogether. Now this is not always possible, but if you can redesign your system such that single-use items are no longer needed, that is the best case scenario. And a good example of this is actually the Scottish government last year removed single-use hot drinks cups from their offices, and actually Historic Environment Scotland has also done the same at their office. So they had to redesign their systems. They had to allow for staff to start bringing reusable cups. They had to provide some crockery on site for people who may have forgotten them, and so on. They had to consider things like accessibility for people with particular needs who maybe need specialized cups or whatever it is, different access. But ultimately, they worked through those issues and they redesigned their hot drink service system such that they no longer have single-use cups on their premises. Now that is a best case scenario. That's really good. If you cannot completely remove something, then you should then look at reducing it. And you can do this through system design as well. And there's kind of two ways you can do that. So one is to improve the relative appeal of reusable alternatives, so relative to the single-use ones. So we'll talk a bit about what will drive reusable alternatives forward in a second. But the other option is to reduce the excess consumption of the single-use items. And some examples of this are McDonald's moved their sauce packets behind the counter. So instead of customers just kind of grabbing a handful of them, now they have to be requested, and that slightly changes the convenience of the single-use sauce packets, and it allows McDonald's to control their distribution. So if you want 2 packets or 3 packets, they will happily give them to you, but they're not going to. But they'll start by giving you 1. You can do this as well with, for example, plastic cutlery. Maybe you've got metal cutlery out front that's available for free access, but you can move the plastic cutlery behind the till, so it's available on request. And it's just about changing the convenience factor of those 2 options so that the relative appeal of the reusable alternative is improved. Another interesting example is making something available at the point of demand as opposed to a just-in-case point. So an example of this would be if you're at the till with your meal and there's the napkins right there, then you might be inclined to take a handful of napkins just in case you need them. If instead those napkins were placed on the table, then you wouldn't need to take any napkins just in case, because you would be able to take them if you spilled something or needed a napkin. And you wouldn't need to take a handful. You could take exactly how many you thought you needed at the time. So, you know, it's these subtle bits of design that can really help to reduce consumption. So the third option is to replace. So this is only when you have truly eliminated all the avoidable single-use items. That is when, using life cycle analysis, you should try to identify the best single-use product alternative. So this is where, if you've said we cannot get rid of any more, we've done everything we can, and we're stuck with these last items, these last single-use items, then you should look at, okay, well, what is the best version of this cup or version of this cutlery or whatever to purchase. And you use life cycle assessment to do that, because it really ties into this fourth option, which is, you know, about recycling. It's about improving waste management outcomes. So you need to speak with your waste contractor and ask them, look, we're thinking about, you know, finding the best option for this, you know, for our single-use cups or our cutlery. And we're considering these, and we want to know, you know, are you able to handle these? Which one of these would be best? Which one of these is most likely to be recycled? And so really having a dialogue with your waste contractor will help you identify the best product and then also improve those outcomes. And that also requires engagement with your customers. So since I last spoke about this, there's been a lot of developments on cups, and I've just highlighted a few here just to show how, like, you know, this issue is very in the public mind, and there's lots of things happening. So as I mentioned already, that the paper cup recycling and recovery group has really started working to publish reports on how they're improving recycling rates. They've launched up in Scotland the Glasgow Cup movement, which is again focused on improving recycling and recycling infrastructure on streets in Glasgow. There's been, you know, industry reports warning about the sort of losses that could occur if a less linear, less sort of wasteful business model were brought about. Interestingly, Starbucks, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, Starbucks has brought in a latte levy of their own of 5p on single-use cups, which is, I think, a really a commendable move from them. The government in the UK has backed away from the proposed latte levy that they were considering when I first spoke. And in part, I think, because of, you know, effective lobbying from groups that were not wanting that to come about. But interestingly, in Scotland, the government has now said that they are looking at a latte levy, and there may be a link between those two. So lots has been happening, and similarly, lots has been happening at Zero Waste Scotland, where we've been doing more work on this to support the Scottish government as they're looking at this issue, and also to help, you know, generally build the knowledge base around single-use items and behavior change and prevention. So I'm going to start going through some of these ideas and these concepts. So one of them is the reuse curve. And the idea here is that you want to move the greatest share of the population, the greatest number of individuals above this line, this sort of curve that you see there, into the reuse area. And there's several things that we know can influence a person to choose a reuse option over a single-use option. And so the first one is environmental awareness or concern. And you can see that that's sort of a smaller area there, and it really affects a fairly small portion of the population. Most people are not so concerned about the environment that they will consciously make a choice to avoid single-use items on a regular basis. So this is important, and it can grow and become more important over time, as we've seen with, for example, with Blue Planet, how many people became concerned about single-use plastics. But generally, this is not a primary motivator for a large portion of the population. So another one is social norms and pressure. And this is, for example, if you're in a workplace and, so for example, my workplace, I work at an environmental organization, and there is a sort of social norm there that bringing a single-use cup into the office it isn't looked well upon, let's say. And so people may, even if they're not necessarily motivated by the environment, they may choose not to. They may choose a reusable option because of the social norms or the pressure, or because they want to look good in front of their peers or whatever. And again, this is a fairly small influencer, but it's a pretty constant one that can encourage some people to adopt reuse. But the big ones are the next two, and it's convenience and cost. And these two are your real important levers for encouraging people to drive to reuse. And the reason they're so important, first off, is because they affect everyone. Everyone cares about convenience and everyone cares about cost. So it doesn't matter how engaged you are with an environmental issue. You don't even need to be aware that there's an environmental issue at play. If one option is more convenient and more affordable, you are more likely to choose it. And so these are the kind of levers that we'll be focused on, and we have focused on in the studies that I'll be sharing. So speaking of convenience, we know that convenience is a really important motivator for people choosing a reusable option. And I presented this previously, but I'll just quickly touch on it again. So we looked at 5 workplace organizations that had their own cafe, like in-house cafe. And then we looked at high street reuse rates. And what we see here is that the reuse rate in high street locations is very low, whereas the reuse rate at workplace locations is higher, significantly higher in almost all cases. And this has no clear correlation with the discount rate being offered, so the reusable cup discount rate. So it's not linked to what the financial incentive is. So we infer that it's because of the convenience. When you're on the high street, the reuse rate is dependent on the everyday consumer carrying around a reusable cup. And that's very inconvenient. These cups take up space, they're messy, they need to be washed, they can spill, and you've got to put them in your purse or in your backpack, or you're carrying them in your hand. And so it's very inconvenient. At a workplace, a reusable cup is much more convenient because you can store it at your desk or in your locker. And really, you only need to be carrying it on your trip between your desk and the cafe site. And so we can infer from this data that convenience is a key motivating factor, and there's a shadow price here of convenience. Now, we can't say what the shadow price is because there's not enough data points here, but we can certainly say that there is one. And it may also be, as I mentioned, that there's some cultural norm elements here. So for example, in organization 1, this is an environmental organization. And so that would explain the really high reuse rate. And we know they've been doing work and staff engagement there, which has helped to raise this rate. And that's the highest rate I've ever seen. It's far higher than any that are reported, although we do see some other very impressive rates around some of the other organizations. So another thing that I've mentioned before, and I wanted to return to, is the issue of discounts. So I've mentioned discounts for reusable cups, and this is ubiquitous throughout the retail sector. So Starbucks, Pret a Manger, Cafe Nero, all of these chains offer some form of discount. In fact, many retailers offer a discount when a customer brings in their reusable cup. But what the evidence shows is that these discounts have little or no impact on reuse rates. In fact, one study by Professor Pertinga at the Cardiff University, that is what they concluded, that it just did not have any impact on the reuse rate when they put in place a discount. So we can see this play out with the Starbucks story. And so briefly, in 2008, Starbucks had a reusable cup rate of under 2%. And the company set a goal of achieving a 25% reuse rate by 2015. And that's really interesting because it just shows that, they didn't really know how difficult this was either. They set a very ambitious target and probably thought that I mean, that it was achievable. But by 2011, their reuse rate was still below 2%. And they realized that this was much more challenging than they had originally anticipated. And so on that basis, they lowered their goal to 5%, which is, you know, a significant reduction and really shows how much their perspective had changed. And by 2015, they'd actually failed to achieve the objective, and the reuse rate remained below 2%. So effectively, over the entire period, they'd not managed even a 1% increase in the reuse rate. And over that time, they experimented with a 50p discount at one point. They also were selling reusable cups for just £1 here in the UK. And they undertook measures like this and others, and they did not prove effective. So what this highlights and what's the underlying issue with discounts is this idea of loss aversion, which is that individuals will do more to avoid an economic loss than they will to obtain an equivalent economic gain. And I'll get into what that means when I talk about some of the charge work we've been doing. But it basically means that discounts, this potential gain, is not a very potent incentive for people. And one of the examples I like to give is with the carrier bag charge, which I think we're all familiar with, where you pay 5p for a carrier bag. Now 5p is a very small amount of money, and especially when you compare it to the average grocery bill. And yet we know that when that 5p charge came into effect in Scotland anyway, it reduced single-use carrier bag consumption by 80%, basically overnight and within that first year. People responded very quickly and very strongly to this very small charge. But imagine if if instead of a charge, it had been a 5p discount on your grocery bill if you were using a reusable bag. So have you used a reusable bag? Get 5p off your grocery bill. And how effective do you imagine that would be as an incentive to get people to reduce their single-use carrier bag consumption? So it's a very subtle difference, and it kind of conflicts with standard economics in that you would assume that two incentives of equal value would have the same impact, but in fact they don't. And so this is what we've been looking into. We wanted to really prove the concept of loss aversion applies here to single-use cups, and I think we can extend that beyond, as you'll see, to other items. So last year we undertook a cost-neutral cup charge trial, and you may remember I was looking for some participants for this when I last spoke. So we did launch this trial, and so it replaced existing reusable cup discounts with cost-neutral single-use cup charges of equal value at 4 cafe locations. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, because it could be a bit complicated, but the table below shows what that looks like. So on the left in the blue column, we have the reusable cup discount system, so the before system. And on the right, we have the charge system, the trial system. And what it shows is that under the reusable cup system, a drink in a disposable coffee cup was being sold for £1. These are hypothetical numbers, not the trial numbers, because we had 4 different locations. But if it was being sold for £1 and there was no charge, so you would be charged £1 for your drink in a disposable cup. If you brought in a reusable cup, you would get 10p off of your drink and pay 90p. Okay, well, under the disposable cup charge system, we reduced the cost of the drink itself to 90p. We sold the cup separately as its own product for 10p, but the ultimate cost to the consumer was exactly the same, £1 for a drink in a disposable cup. So there's been no change in total sale price for the consumer, but there's a different signal there. And we've gotten rid of the reusable cup discount. So if you buy your drink in a reusable cup, you're just buying the drink for 90p. So the price is the exact same. It's the optics which we've changed. Now we use baseline sales data and reuse data from the previous year over that same trial period to account for any seasonal fluctuations, as well as 5 weeks prior to the trial. So we had the most recent sales and reuse data, and then we compared that with the reuse and sales data we collected over the 5-week trial period. And we also conducted a customer survey to gauge how people felt about the change and about the charge. So what we found was that the reuse rate significantly increased across all 4 sites with an average increase of 185%, which is huge. And with no change in cost for the consumer or the retailer. This was simply changing the numbers within the price, but the price was the same. So no one was losing money, no one was being asked to pay more. And we got a significant increase in the reuse rate. Now, our survey found that 79% of respondents supported the cup charge, and this supports a previous Marine Conservation Society survey that found 74% of Brits support a cup charge. And so there's a lot of strong support from people, particularly after they've experienced the charge and they understand, you know, how it works and where that it doesn't impact their costs in this case. And critically, we found no significant impact in sales. So we did have to isolate for a couple days where one of the coffee machines broke down in one of the retail locations, which obviously affected sales. But if we account for that, there was no significant impact in sales. And so the conclusion that we draw from this study is, I think, quite a powerful one for retailers and for universities and colleges and places that operate retail locations, is by simply replacing the existing reusable cup discount with an equivalent cost-neutral cup charge, you can significantly increase your reuse rate without impacting sales and without increasing costs for consumers. So it's basically doing more with the exact same pricing structure that you've got. You're just inverting it. So as I just wanted to return back to the Starbucks story, because interestingly, they also have put in place a charge. And so in 2018, they partnered with Hubbub to trial a 5p charge at select London locations. And the results were a significant increase in their reuse rate. So more than doubled to 5.8%. So they finally achieved that 5% target they had set out for themselves. And in response to that, they have rolled that 5p charge out to all their locations in the UK. So, which is quite commendable, I think, for Starbucks, because they're the only major retailer to adopt a charge. And while it's not a very high charge, it just goes to show that even a 5p charge can have a significant impact. So how does our study show up against other studies that have looked at charging? Well, here's all of the charge studies that we are aware of. And in every single case, the use of a charge resulted in a significant increase in the reuse rate. So working across, Portinga and Whitaker did their study out of Cardiff University, and that one really got a lot of attention, and ultimately they were asked to provide evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, and that's sort of where the latte levy got its start. And then Winchester University adopted a charge. Starbucks has adopted a charge. Berkeley University and Tufts University in the US have adopted charges. And then here are our 4 sites in the study I just mentioned. So there's not enough data out there yet to firmly understand how the value of the charge affects the reuse rate and what the optimal charge might be. But what we can say without any doubt is that a charge will increase the reuse rate. And it has in every case it's been used, which I think is very compelling. So the second study I wanted to introduce is the University of Hospital Crosshouse study that we undertook. And this was an 8-week trial, which we did last year. And it was delivered by NHS Scotland and Zero Waste Scotland and supported by Amaray, Reach, and Borealis, who are cup manufacturers, and Borealis is a raw material provider. So they supported by providing the cups that were used in this trial. So to give you an overview of what this was a more complicated trial because we were using a range of different measures. Going back to that curve that I mentioned, we were using, we were working on convenience and cost, and also environmental messaging. and using a combination of both push and pull methods. And I'll kind of cover what that looks like. So the first thing we did was, in the dining area of Crosshouse Hospital, they had 2 different cups in use. So soup cups were made out of polystyrene, and then hot drink cups were your standard sort of plastic-lined paper cups. And what we wanted to do, and this is part of a wider work that NHS is exploring, which is to basically consolidate as many plastics into a single type of polymer to make things more recyclable. So rather than having many different products made of many different polymers, trying to consolidate those into a single one. And so in this case, we're looking at polypropylene, which is a highly recyclable plastic as far as plastics go. So what we did was we eliminated the polystyrene cups, and we eliminated the plastic-lined paper cups, and we replaced them both with one cup, which is a polypropylene cup, which is one polymer, easily recyclable using the standard dry mixed recycling collection and the standard recycling facilities. So this kind of goes against the grain of the plastics backlash, because here, in fact, we're bringing in a plastic item because we identified it as being more suitable. And more recyclable and easier to message for customers. So that's what we did, is we replaced the single-use ones with a single-use cup. But what we also did was we brought in a reusable, recyclable polypropylene cup, and we provided those to all hospital staff on request. Basically, we had a booth, and I think we handed out a couple thousand of them. So about half of the staff in the hospital got a cup. And the others could have, of course, they just didn't come and get one. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've got some posters, and these were some of the posters that we used for the trial. So you can see we had a branded blue cup, and this was a hardy cup. You know, it was firm to hold and definitely feels reusable. It's not a single-use cup and can be used many times, hundreds of times, and washed and machine washed and so on. And then we had this white single-use cup, and we created our messaging around those 2 cups and why the blue cup is best. So in addition to providing, you know, changing the cups that we provided for single-use cups and then providing staff with these reusable cups, we also brought in a cost-neutral 10p charge for those same single-use cups that we had brought in. So we reduced the cost of beverages, and then we sold the single-use cups separately. So instead, where previously you had been buying one thing, which was a cup of coffee, now you were buying 2 things. You were buying coffee and a cup. So that is a push mechanism, because it's pushing people away from single-use cups. Providing staff with the reusable cups was a pull mechanism, because it's making it easier to choose reuse. We also provided staff with a reuse card, and that gave staff the 10th drink free when they were using their reusable cup. So every time they purchased a drink in a reusable cup, they got a stamp. And that, again, is a pull method, because it's pulling you towards reuse. And the other nice thing about that is that it's a latent reward. So with the cup charge, that financial incentive is applied every single time you purchase. But with the reuse card, that's something you're working towards. So it's sort of an objective that you're working towards over time. And so they kind of operate in 2 different time spaces. Beyond that, we also redesigned the dining area. And I say redesigned, it really wasn't that complicated. But what we noticed was there was sort of a pathway that that someone would go with their tray when they were trying to get rid of their their garbage. And the first thing they would come to was the residual waste area. So of course that's sending the wrong message, because if the very first thing you're seeing, and of course you just want to get rid of this, and if the first option is to get rid of all of it by putting it in the residual bin, then that's what a lot of people will do. So what we did was we moved that to the end of the line. We moved the recycling stuff to the front of the line. We put up more signage explaining. There was signs over each bin saying, this bin will make sure the stuff gets recycled. This bin will be sent to landfill or burned. And then we also brought in cup recycling bins, because as I mentioned, all of our cups are made of a single polymer, which means they can all be recycled together and they can slot right into the bins. And then again, we issued a staff survey to gauge sentiment on the trial. So that's an overview of everything we did for this trial. And the results for this, I have to say, were really excellent. So the first thing was the reuse rate and increased from 1 to 43%. And bearing in mind that this only targeted staff. So we did not change the prices for patients or for visitors, and we did not offer patients or visitors reusable cups. So nothing was changed for them except that they were now using these single-use polypropylene cups. But the whole reuse incentive structure that we created was really targeted at staff, and nonetheless, we increased the reuse rate from 1 to 43%. And if that system is made permanent, that would result in saving 57,000 cups a year at this one hospital. The recycle rate also went from 0% to 75%. Now it was 0% because neither of those, the previous cups were recyclable, and we moved to a recyclable cup and recyclable infrastructure. So, so that's a huge change, of course. Another finding, and this was one we weren't expecting, but we're very pleased to see, is that both hot drink sales and soup sales significantly increased. And again, keeping in mind that the whole system change really was targeted at staff. So these increases probably occurred, exclusively within the staff segment of the market and not in the visitor segment of the market or the patient segment of the market. And so that was really interesting. We didn't actually expect this, so we didn't really drill into it in our survey, but I would guess that in part it was about, the more attractive pricing structure that was offered, the free cups that were given out, the buzz about it. So, that's just a hypothesis, but we can't really say why, but certainly it was very significant, and it was a concern at the time whether this trial would result in a reduction in sales, and obviously it was the exact opposite. So in terms of survey responses, we had some really strong results here as well. So on the left-hand side, I've got the pre and post-trial responses, and this is the frequency respondents claimed to use their reusable cup before and after the trial. And what you can see is the survey respondents claimed pre-trial that only about 10% of them were always using their reusable cup. And post-trial, that was nearly 1 in 2 people. So a really significant increase there. And a corresponding shrinkage in the people who never used a reusable cup. Now, interestingly, one of the things that we observed there was that over time, people started bringing in their own cups. So, we saw a lot more of our the blue cups we had provided in the beginning, but over time, many people ended up going and getting a cup that they really liked or something, something special, and that could, it could be because that, they wanted a cup that had certain features. Could also be that 2,000 people running around with the same cup could be confusing. And I also noticed that some people were writing their names on their cups or putting stickers on their cups and kind of making it their own. So we also asked people how they felt about the charge in general. And as you can see, the vast majority of people who responded to these 3 questions were very supportive. So almost exactly the same as the previous survey we did, about 79% of people said that they would like to see more retailers in Scotland charge separately for disposable cups. Many said that they wanted to see the same scheme applied elsewhere in the NHS. And again, many wanted to see that same system retained at the Crosshouse Hospital. So overall, it was a very strong response in the survey as well as from the data. Now, this is an interesting finding, which is that staff, when we asked them what were the most important elements of the trial, the 2 that were most important to them were the environmental outcomes of the trial. So knowing that the cups were being recycled and disposing of less cups. That's what most people said were important. And they did, you know, generally people also said that, you know, getting the 10th drink free was important, and saving 10p on hot drinks, that was important. Getting the free cup was important. But clearly it was the environmental impacts were the most important. And what's interesting about this is that, at least on the disposing of less cups point, they could always bring in their own reusable cup prior to the trial. That was always an option. And yet we saw that only 1% of sales were in reusable cups. So while customers may not consciously identify financial benefits as being a key driver of behavior change, the evidence suggests that actually it is an important driver, even if that's not how they identify, even if that's not the issue that they identify as having driven them to change. So it's important to communicate the environmental benefits and to show that what you're doing has an environmental impact, but that alone does not seem to be enough to drive the kind of level of reuse that, you know, we should be aiming for. So in summary of this study, a combination of push and pull measures were used, and the reuse rate increased from 1 to 43%, preventing 57,000 cups a year if it were extended over a year. The recycle rate for single-use cups rose from 0 to 75%. Hot drink sales and soup sales increased. Survey respondents strongly supported the trial and cup charging more generally, and staff ranked the environmental benefits as being very important to them, even if the financial benefits appear to be a key motivator. So that's everything I wanted to cover. So in conclusion, I guess, summarizing all this up, recycling does not reduce single-use item consumption. It's important to make sure these items are recyclable, but it really is the bare minimum. And in a circular economy, it's sort of the last thing we should be focusing on. We really need to focus on prevention first. Biodegradables are replacing one single-use item with another. They too do not reduce single-use item consumption. If you are going to go down that route, and again, we aren't currently recommending that, if you are going to go down that route, you need to ensure that that waste is properly managed and you've set up a system that can accommodate that. And that's not just your waste, that's not just your waste contractor, it's the way you're communicating this messaging to your customers and staff to really make sure that you're not just swapping in an incompatible single-use item with your current system. Prevention is the best case because it eliminates the whole impact of a single-use item. And the single-use hierarchy shows that you should focus on removal first, then reduction, replacing what remains, and ensuring that what remains can be recycled. The reuse curve shows that environmental values and norms can encourage some people to adopt reuse, but really it's convenience and cost that are the primary drivers. Loss aversion shows that people will respond more to avoid a loss than to obtain an equivalent gain, and that's how we know that simply replacing discounts with charges of the same value will result in a higher reuse rate at no extra cost to the consumer or the retailer. It's simply a more effective way of using the same value of incentive. And finally, you can use a combination of push and pull measures to drive behavior change. So you can achieve change by making something more expensive, but if you can make the preferred alternative more convenient or cheaper, that is how you can drive the kind of scale of change that we're looking for. And of course, the evidence work continues. We're still and always working on building the evidence here. We've got a few more projects underway now, and so I'm hopeful that 12 months time or whatever, I'll be able to come and give another presentation and update you on some more exciting work we've been doing on this and other single-use item issues. So thank you very much.
Hi, Claire, you're just muted, so we can't hear you.
Thanks, Sam. Apologies, Michael, thank you for that. We don't have much time for questions, so if anyone does have any burning questions to ask, Eve Nelson just asked, she's not sure if she missed it, but the 75% increase in recycling rate and 43% reuse rate, over what time period was that?
Yeah, so that was, the reuse rate was well, both of them were the average that was observed over the course of the 8-week trial. So
Okay.
the reuse rate very quickly jumped from 1 to 43%-ish, and we have it kind of jumping along as you saw in that graph.
Okay. And David Chapman would like to know if you know of any groups in the Midlands, England, that can compost biodegradable items.
I couldn't say. My colleagues will have a better sense of that, but I'm not sure if they'd know about England. But you could certainly contact the main waste contractors in your area and ask them, and they'd be able to tell you.
Okay, great.
Oh.
Anyone else got any questions? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Hi,
No,
it's Olivia from King's College. Hi, I do have a quick question. If your caterers do still or can't replace everything and eliminate and do still want to use a disposable item, and I'm trying to move them away from biodegradable, have you looked at how people react to moving back to plastics? Because I know that was in one of the things, and I know a clean plastic pot could go in recyclables, but also we want to keep our dry mix recycling really clean and not have salads and sauces going in there. So I'm struggling with finding a simple answer to go back to them and say, well, if you don't use biodegradables, it's better to use X. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a really tough challenge, and it's one we see all the time. So with the Crosshouse trial, we did get some feedback in the surveys, although it was only a few people who said, why are we switching to plastics when plastics are, destroying the oceans and things like this. But for most people, I think they grasped that ultimately what we were trying to do was make sure that this material was recyclable, and that we were switching to something that was going to be recycled responsibly. It wasn't going to landfill. It wasn't going to go to an incinerator. But with cups, that's quite easy because you tip them upside down and they basically are clean enough. With the kind of materials or the products you're talking about where there's food waste inside, the contamination issue is very real, and it's hard to see how you avoid that without like some sort of washing station. And there's all sorts of considerations around that too. So unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer for that. That is an area that I think we need to look into. But yeah, it's a challenge that lots of people are going through. So you're not alone.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I've had one more question on the chat, and then I think we're going to have to close. So it was one from Hugh Evans. They've tackled the obvious areas: usable coffee cups and latte levees, single-use catering items. They want to look at a more challenging area. So laboratories, single-use, and I know I've had a question on laboratories again, so it might be one for another session. Or any advice on other areas of single-use plastic?
So laboratories is a pretty niche area, and I'm sure you'd be better placed than I to think about how you might bring reusables into that. So I couldn't really say, although hopefully you can apply some of the concepts that are there. But unfortunately, I couldn't really say. But I'd be really interested to know what you're looking at, and if it was something you wanted to chat about, I'd be happy to, and see if we could come up with some ideas.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
There's a few people saying yes, it'd be great to understand about laboratory stuff.
Okay.
And then there's one more quick one. Instead of plastics, have you looked at vegware for a single-use option?
Yeah, so vegware is one of the dominant biodegradable packaging options, and frequently when people say we've switched to biodegradables, that's what they've gone with is vegware. My understanding is that they do offer a dedicated collection service. I'm not sure under what conditions you can get that, but through that collection service, they would ensure that that's treated properly. And And I think that's a really good idea if you're going to go down that route. But as I say, that really should be the last resort to switch one single-use item with another. But if you are going to do it, yeah, make sure it's picked up by someone who can guarantee you it's going to be treated properly and that they know the product that they're going to be collecting. So obviously Vegware will know their own products and be able to recognize them and ensure they're treated properly on a picking line or whatever.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate your time today and for answering a few questions there. We'll certainly have a few people asking about laboratories, so we will have a look into that and see if we can find someone who can talk specifically on laboratories. If anyone has any feedback, please don't hesitate to email us or would like anything else covered. That's scotland@eauc.org.uk.